Mr. President, it's a pleasure to be in your city, first of all, this city where you started your political career. To be here in Russia, which is a great country with a historic past and an important role to play in the future, and its demand that its history and its size, its culture, and its military strength and its possibilities give it a big role. There are big issues that can only be solved if Russia participates, and you will play a definitive role in that. And we want to find out what you think about security and freedom, about friends and enemies, about borders and threats, about economic policy and foreign policy, about Ukraine and the Baltic states, about Europe and the United States, about Syria and Iran, and about China and Russia. They're important problems and important conflicts that Russia will be part of the solution. None more important than the borders of Russia, none more important than Ukraine. Begin this afternoon and help us understand as you see it. Where are we? How do we get there? And where do we go from here?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for agreeing to work with us here today to be the moderator of this meeting. This forum is called the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, so probably it would be better to concentrate our attention on the economic issues, but I agree with you, without finding a solution to a number of acute international crises, hardly any advances can be achieved. We've been talked about Ukraine repeatedly. We understand there is no evading this question. But, you know, we always talk either about Ukraine, about something related to Ukraine. Several years ago, we talked about the crisis in Iraq, crises in different other countries. We're talking about what has already transpired, but we never talk about why it has happened. But if you want to talk about it, which is evidently quite important, I should like to start with this very issue. Why is there a crisis in Ukraine? I was quite confident that after the bipolar system went into oblivion after the collapse of the Soviet Union, certain Western partners of ours, particularly the United States, were in a kind of euphoria. And instead of trying to create in a new situation, good neighborly partner relations, they started to explore new, free geopolitical spaces, well, free in their view. And that's why we were witnessing the expansion of NATO eastward and other phenomena. I was always wondering why that was happening, and finally I arrived at a conclusion. I thought that some of our partners were under the illusion that after the Second World War there used to be one world order, and now that the USSR was gone, they thought there was vacuum which had to be filled. And I think that is not the right approach towards finding a solution to these issues. And that's why Iraq happened. We know, and our partners agree, that there were errors committed in Iraq. But still, it happened once again in Libya and now in Ukraine. We are not the original cause of those crisis phenomena which are happening in Ukraine. They should not have supported the illegal coup d'etat, anti-constitutional coup d'etat, as well as a forceful seizure of power, which finally resulted in a serious confrontation in Ukraine and a civil war, as it were. What has to be done now? Today, no doubt, the agreements reached in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, should be observed. Let me emphasize, if we were not content with something, we wouldn't have put our signature there. But we have put our signature under those documents, and we will seek their full implementation. I'd like to draw your attention to this fact, your attention and the attention of our partners, but we cannot do that unilaterally, and I'm repeating it over and over again. They're telling us Russia has to influence somehow the situation in the southeast part of Ukraine, but that is not enough. Influence has to be exercised also on the central authorities in Kiev, and we cannot do that. This is the avenue which has to be pursued by our Western partners, the Europeans, the United States. Let's work together.
What do you want the Kiev government to do?
Мы ничего не хотим.
We don't want them anything to do. It is the Ukrainian people that has to want something from the government, either to do or not to do. We believe that to achieve a settlement, the Minsk agreements have to be implemented, and the key issue here is no doubt the political component, and there are several elements to the political settlement. First, the constitutional reform, and the Minsk agreements say that quite clearly, either with providing an autonomous status or stipulating for a decentralization, as our colleagues put it. Everyone understands what that is. Our European partners, the Germans and the French, have explained what this decentralization stands for, and the Donbass and the Kiev authorities are okay with that. Secondly, the law on the special status of these territories, the Luhansk and Donbass unrecognized republics, has to be enacted. It has to be enforced. It has been promulgated, but it is not being implemented yet. And to that end, a decree of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, has to be adopted. And that what the Minsk agreements stipulate for. Formally, our Kiev friends have done it. But once this decree was adopted by the Rada, they also introduced amendments to the law. As a matter of fact, bringing it to naught. So instead of manipulations, they have to start practical work. Thirdly, there has to be a law on political amnesty. You cannot be engaged in a political dialogue with people who are in danger of criminal prosecution. And finally, a law has to be adopted on municipal elections in these territories. And these elections have to be performed. All that is stipulated in the Minsk agreements, and I'm drawing your particular attention to that. And all that has to be done in concert and in coordination with the representatives of the Minsk, southwest part of Ukraine. Unfortunately, too much time has passed since the signing of these agreements. Now, a direct dialogue is required between Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kiev. That is what is missing. And finally, an economic rehabilitation of these territories has to be launched. I have said that repeatedly. The excuse of having no money doesn't work here. And if the current Kiev leadership believe that this is the territory of Ukraine, that Ukrainian citizens reside there who are entitled, say, to disability allowance, then they have to do something. They cannot refuse to pay these allowances. Otherwise, they are violating their own constitution. All that has to be implemented, and not just in words, but also in practice.
United States. As you know, the United States believes that you are arming the separatists and you are encouraging them, and that you are using the Russian armed services, and that adds to the conflict, that heightens the emergency, and many people worry that it's tending towards some new Cold War.
Знаете, к холодной войне приводит не...
You know, Cold War is caused not by local conflicts, but by global decisions like the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the ABM treaty. that is indeed a step which pushes all of us towards a new spiral of confrontation because it shifts the global security system as to regional conflicts wherever they happen. Curiously, warring parties always find arms somewhere. And the same goes about the eastern part of Ukraine. What I want to say is that if today's situation is resolved via political means, no arms will be required. But to achieve that, there has to be goodwill as well as the willingness to be engaged in a direct dialogue. We want to facilitate that. We're going to facilitate that, but we'll never agree if anyone somewhere will try to speak from the position of force, either with the police or the militia or special forces or armed forces, until armed units and the so-called nationalist battalions arrived in those territories. No arms had been present there, and there would have been no arms in those territories if they tried from the very outset to resolve the issue via political means. Arms arrived there after armed forces started to be used against those rebels. They're trying to resist, and once they try to resolve it by political means, no arms will be required.
What are acceptable borders for Ukraine, for Russia? What borders are acceptable for you?
Что вы имеете в виду, когда говорите о границе?
What do you mean when you're talking about borders? Geographical borders or political borders? What are you
Political
talking
borders.
about specifically?
Что касается сотрудничества, мы всегда...
As for cooperation, we've always said, and we're going to say that in future, there's nothing new about that. Despite all the difficulties of today, I've always thought that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, at least one ethnic group. Well, certainly they have their cultural peculiarities, but they have common culture, common spiritual foundations, common history. Whatever happens, in the end, Russia and Ukraine are destined to a common futurity. From the very beginning, we have thought that Ukraine has the right to make its own choice, civilizational, economic, political choice. It's no secret, we all know that it was Russia who initiated the disintegration of the USSR. We initiated providing sovereignty to all these countries, and nothing happened. But both Russia and Ukraine, apart from being bound by those ties that I've told you about, they're also bound by the realities of today, the common engineering infrastructure, the common energy infrastructure, the common transportation system, uniform regulation framework. And we can also speak one language with no hindrances. And it is related to us directly. It is related to our interests. We've always assumed that we are going to resolve all controversies, and it's quite natural that controversies arise via negotiations. But if third parties start to be engaged in this process, they have, we believe, to take into account our interests as well, and not just try to put us before a choice. So in the political dimension, we look forward to a full-fledged and equal dialogue.
I want to come back to Ukraine, but let's talk about the relationship that Russia has with a number of countries, including the United States and China and others. Characterize the relationship with the United States. What's wrong with it? What's right with it? What does it need?
Другими словами, где у нас
In other words, what are the positive sides and what are the problems? Let's start with the problems. The problem consists in they're trying to impose on us their decisions and their standards without thinking about how we understand our own interests. As a matter of fact, they are trying to say that they know better what we need. Let us decide ourselves what are our interests, what are needs based on our history, on our culture.
How are they doing that? How is the United States trying to decide what you need?
вмешиваясь в наши политические
Interfering into our internal political processes,
через финансирование
including via financing non-governmental sector, imposing decisions on international security. I mentioned the problems which we faced for the first time, which immediately cooled down our relations. I'm referring to Iraq. Those who are not with us are against us. Is it a dialogue? It is an ultimatum. We are not to be talked by the language of ultimatum. Now, things that bring us together, there are some. We are united by our desire to work against common threats, which include terrorism, drug trafficking, and a very dangerous trend of the possibility of weapons of mass destruction spread. Now about humanitarian interaction, fight against difficult contagious diseases encompassing various regions. There are global economy issues. First of all, I'm referring to the area where we can have our influence on energy. There are many other areas in which we have established decent interaction, and hopefully that will form the groundwork to restore the former level of relations with the United States and move further. Now about China. The nature, the level of trust in our relations have reached an unprecedented scale and importance in the history of our contacts. For 40 years, I'm reiterating, we have been negotiating on the border issue. We have found mutually acceptable compromises, and this issue is no longer there. We have settled it for 40 years, and not always do we manage to address those issues with other countries. We develop economic contacts. We are actively cooperating within the framework of international organizations, within the framework of the United Nations. We are developing and forging new integration processes which are quite efficient and attractive for other countries. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, initially, it was established to settle border issues after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it didn't stop there. And now this organization is attractive for many other countries. At the next ASEO summit, which will take place in Ufa in Bashkiria, a decision might be made to receive Pakistan and India as full-fledged members of this organization. We cooperate within the framework of other organizations, within the framework of BRICS. And in my speech, I mentioned the need to undertake concerted efforts and to bring together the efforts of the Eurasian Economic Union and the integration process of the Silk Road. So we are establishing relations in this field as well. China is our largest trade and economic partner, and our relations are very efficient.
Some say it's a natural relationship because China has cash and Russia has natural resources. So there's a natural affinity right there.
Вы почитайте, Андрей.
Well, just read the American literature. I'm sure that you know about that. We are just pretending that you're not familiar with it. The American analytical scientists, political experts speak about the United States turning towards China. China is a growing economy. If anyone is concerned with the declining growth rates, then the first deputy chair of Secretary of China, 7% growth, the highest in the world. And it's not only Russia, the whole world is turning towards Asia. Europe is interested in it as well. And we are destined to do that because we are neighbors. It is a natural affinity. It is a natural movement and development. Besides, there are many values which are common for us, which we protect at the international arena. There is an equal access to addressing international issues.
Is it a more natural affinity than Europe and the United States? Is China more in the future a place that Russia feels more comfortable than with Europe and the United States? And could that lead to some anti-Western alliance?
Антизападный.
Anti-Western, anti-American alliance between.
Мы вообще ни с кем, в том числе и с Китаем, а Китай тоже ни с
Well,
кем.
China, including us, are not forging relations against someone. We are not building alliances against anyone. We are building alliances for implementing and meeting our own national interests. Let me draw your attention to the fact. You are expanding the NATO. There is no Soviet Union anymore, but NATO was created as a counterweight to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc. NATO keeps expanding, but we don't create any military alliances with China. We do not tend to adopt a bloc-based approach. What we're trying to do is to adopt a global approach. We are trying to distribute the responsibilities. We are striving to find mutually acceptable compromises. We are never based on the position of force. We are trying to find new solutions within the framework of negotiations.
To have read much about you and your country, there are three things that I constantly see. One is your sense of wanting to be respected. Another is to want to have an equal conversation. A third is a sense of, perhaps in your history, a great concern about borders and having a buffer zone for Russia. Am I accurate in that?
Какой зоны?
A buffer zone would be Ukraine, a buffer zone would be...
I see. Значит, вы понимаете, вот я все время это слышу. Россия.
Well, I keep hearing that Russia wants to be respected. Don't you want to be respected? Isn't there anyone who wants to be not respected and humiliated? That is a strange way to see things. As if it is an exclusion which Russia demands to be respected. Is anyone who wants to be neglected and humiliated? It's not about respect or the lack of respect. The thing is that we want to meet and our own interests without detriment to our partners. But naturally, we count on a constructive, direct, and substantial dialogue. And when there is none, or we see the unwillingness to talk to us, then there is a counter response on our side. I'll tell you an interesting story. It has to do with the so-called Eastern Partnership promoted by our colleagues and friends in the Western Europe. By the way, that is actually promoted by the United States as well. Our first response to the Eastern Partnership initiative very positive. We assumed that Russia and Eastern European countries are linked by various aspects, common technical regulations, common infrastructure, economic ties, and we believe that if Europe started working with them, inevitably a constructive dialogue would be launched on interaction with Russia. We would continue working. There might be some divergences, some convergences, and mutually acceptable solutions would be reached in order to create a common economic and finally humanitarian space. But nothing like that happened. How did the crisis in Ukraine emerge? Ukraine was proposed to sign an association agreement. Great. As everybody knows, Ukraine is a free trade area member within the framework of the CIS, and it is Ukraine who insisted on establishing CIS. There were lots of incentives and benefits. For 17 years, we have been negotiating with the EU on the conditions of our accession to the WTO, and at one go, through Ukraine, they decided to get to the territory of the Russian Federation. Is that the way people do things? And on our proposal to hold consultations, we were answered, it's none of your business. Is that the way issues are discussed and problems are settled, particularly with Russia? It's not about just respect. We want our interests to be taken into account.
Let me talk about a couple of places where there's a dramatic need for cooperation between the United States and Russia. One is Iran and the nuclear negotiations and the P5+1. Do you think there will be an agreement? And what kind of agreement do you want to see?
Первое, что я хочу
Well, the
подчеркнуть,
first thing which I'd like to highlight and which I think of the principal matter, we have a common understanding with all the participants of this process, including the US, including the European countries, and I hope that with Iran as well, that all of us are against the WMD spreading throughout the territories, and this is our principal position, and this what helps us to constructively work with the United States in this direction. We are very glad that the Iranian position has changed a lot, which allowed us to achieve the level of agreement which we have today. We will support these agreements, of course, and these arrangements. The only counterproductive thing, as I think, it would be to specially undermine by these agreements by demanding Iran to do something which it can't do and which is not quite important to solve the main non-proliferation problem. But I really hope that it would not come to this. And in the nearest time, well, Mr. Lavrov knows better. When do we have to sign it? When can we sign it? Well, when it is ready, he says. Well, diplomats always like that. He said when it's ready. But I believe that in some time there will be some signing. And we yesterday met the Director General of the IAEA, and after the signing there must be implementation of the arrangements, which will require about 6 months. But there is another important thing. It is important that your country, the US, would support such initiative. For the Congress to support it, it's important. We know the discussions ongoing in the US now that the president has the right to sign these agreements, that they do not need ratification by the Congress. Well, that's not our problem. We can't solve it because we can't solve even maybe some problems for the Kyiv authorities and for the Washington authorities neither. So I believe that the ball is on your side now, and we expect that even among all the difficulties, the President of the United States will achieve the result, which would be one of his main achievements in the foreign policy.
But you do believe there will be an agreement, according to what Foreign Minister Lavrov is telling you.
Yes, I do believe in it. And we are aimed at achieving this result because we believe it is very important to defuse the situation. But of the same importance is this following thing. All the countries in the region must not feel that there is a moment coming for them after which they can expect the aggravation of the situation or some threats emerging. We can't let this happen, this feeling to emerge. Russia is aimed at developing good neighborly relations both with Iran and with all the countries in the region.
One other foreign policy issue before we turn it to the economy and the global considerations that have been raised by a number of speakers here this afternoon. It is Syria. Do you see a way out of this? Because Russia has been supporting the Assad government. Iran has been supporting the Assad government. Yet it seems to be like a pendulum swinging one way and then the other. What is your solution to a terrible civil war with millions of refugees, and when can it be done?
Well, the sooner the better, I think. But at the same time, I'd like to highlight one thing. Our position is based on the concern that Syria might submerge into the same situation as Lebanon. Syria could, as Libya, that was the slip of the tongue. Yes, Libya. The Syria can become Libya. Or like Iraq. Because, you know, before the authorities in Iraq and Saddam Hussein himself were destroyed, there were no terrorists there. There had been no terrorists. Let's not forget that, because it's actually, people prefer not to speak about that. But who created the conditions and how the conditions were created for terrorism to outburst on that territories? Isn't that clear how? After the invasion to Iraq, the authorities have been destroyed, Saddam was hanged, and then the ISIS came there, the Islamic State. And what happened in Libya? Full disintegration, no state at all. Even the diplomatic service of the US have felt losses, and we know this about this tragic case in Libya. And we do not want similar scenario to be implemented in Syria. That is the baseline of our position to support President Assad and his government at the moment. And we believe that the position is correct, because it would be difficult to expect anything else from us under the circumstances. Moreover, as I think, many people even agree with that position. And I have mentioned for several times Iraq. I've mentioned Iraq several times. We know the situation there. We know what is happening. The U.S. are supporting Iraq now. They are arming the army. They train the soldiers. And with 2 or 3 swoops, the ISIS captured so many weapons that the Iraq army even doesn't have it. The armored equipment, missiles, etc. I don't think it's the knowledge of the broad community, but now ISIS is armed better than the Iraq army supported by the U.S. Okay, they withdrawn, but our special services and the information from Iraq shows that thousands of American troops are still in Iraq. And what's the result? Quite sad one, and quite a tragic one. And we would not like the same thing to be repeated in Syria. And we are urging all our partners, including the US, the Europeans, but primarily the US, to take additional efforts, to fight this absolute evil of fundamentalism and the so-called Islamic State and some other groups of the same kind, which in their essence are just branches of the notorious terrorist organizations, global terrorist organizations, which actually struck upon the U.S. themselves. We are urging to find the political settlement way, which of course would provide for transformation of the political regime, and we are ready to discuss that with President Assad as well. By the way, just recently, in the UN, an opportunity of cooperation with President Assad was declared in struggling with ISIS and other terrorist groups and formations. And we are ready to work with the president for the sake of providing political transformation. For all the people living in Syria feeling the access to the instruments of power, of course, in order to avoid the military solution of the conflict. It can't be done from outside with the use of force. That's the matter.
Okay, but are you prepared to urge Assad to step down if it would lead to an alternative political solution that would be a bulwark against ISIS going into Damascus?
Well, our moderator is a real American, I say. I was saying without external interference, and he is saying whether I am ready to urge. Only Syrian people can urge President to step down. That's elementary. Well, I've said that we are ready to be in a dialogue with President Assad in the direction of him meeting the and making the political reforms with the representatives of the so-called healthy opposition. I believe that is quite constructive and implementable. Thank you.
President, let me turn this back to the economy, although I have many, many questions, as you can imagine. Ronnie Chan is there, who is chairman of Hang Along Properties. Also to his left is Mahmoud Al-Kuhiji. And we want to also talk to, on my right, far right is Heinz Hermann Thiel, and also on my near right is Miguel Galuccio, who is with UPF from Argentina, and as you know, there are many things to talk about on the energy front with him. But Ronnie, with respect to much that you've heard about China today, what are the possibilities, do you believe, for a relationship, an increasingly beneficial relationship of some significance between Russia and China?
Well, from the president's words, it seems to me that economic is really the main thing of cooperation between China and Russia. On that front, as a business person, it seems to me that Russia and China are made in heaven, a couple made in heaven. One has all the natural resources, one of the richest in the world, and China is very, very short of natural resources while it quickly developing. But it does have the capital to purchase and to help. And I just see that from an economic perspective, I cannot think of two countries that complement each other so well. The only thing, if I may be allowed to say, is this, that whereas I'm sure the president has his strategic thinking vis-a-vis Russia's relationship with China, I'm not sure if your businessmen are ready to take advantage of the China market. Look around. How many Chinese are in the audience? I feel very lonely here. And how many Russians are in China? I don't know. And so I get the sense in the last day or two, discussing with many friends here, Russian friends here, that Asia is still something that is nice to have, but not quite prepared to jump in economically. The president just mentioned that China is very, very significant economically in the world, rising. And I just wish, Mr. President, that your business leader who are sitting everywhere here will be more prepared to take advantage of it. For example, you mentioned about the financing that is necessary for many of the Russian projects. Well, many companies these days from around the world are listed in Hong Kong because Hong Kong stock market is now linked up to the Shanghai one and soon to be with the Shenzhen one as well. And let me remind you, the Shanghai Stock Exchange is the 5th largest in the world, Hong Kong is 6th largest in the world, and the Shenzhen one is, I think, number 8 largest in the world. While the three of them put together, it is the 2nd largest stock market in the world. And why not Russian companies list in Hong Kong, and then all the mainland capital can then invest in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange nowadays through the Hong Kong Shanghai Stock Connect? It seems to be a great opportunity.
Mr. President.
Я согласен.
Well, I completely agree with our Chinese colleague about the fact that Russian-Chinese relations in economy must be filled with practical content and work, not only at the level of the largest companies, but on the level of the SMEs as well, for it to become a real live tissue of joint work in many areas of joint production. At the same time, China is our first trade partner. We have $85 billion per year turnover. And yesterday I spoke about that with the first deputy president of the State Council, and also I discussed that with President Xi Jinping, where I believe we could achieve $200 billion turnover. Of course, you've voiced the right idea. We must be careful of creating the necessary conditions to cooperate. That concerns us and our Chinese partners. I mentioned in my speech that we are not limiting the flow of capital in any way, even under the most difficult conditions of the crisis of 2008-2009. Even last year, we did not put barriers to the flow of capital. But we do expect that our partners, within their own regulatory measures, would act in the similar way, because yuan is becoming a stronger and stronger regional reserve currency. That's a fact, and the experts understand that there's the lack of capital flow freedom, capital movement freedom. If that happens, it would be another serious step to liberalize our relations, and we understand quite well that our Chinese partners must be careful in implementing that, and they know better when they should introduce these or those measures. But an important step to deepen and expand our relations would be a decision to pay our trade operations in national currencies, yuans and rubles, transactions in national currencies. And recently there have been first tradings in this couple of currencies, ruble, yuan, and we hope that this initiative will be developing further on, and it will create additional opportunities for working in the real economy areas. But on the whole, I agree completely. We must move forward and not be oriented only on the governmental arrangements or on the decisions taken by sovereign funds, etc. It's of course very important too, because it creates the platform for further cooperation, for broader cooperation. But we are working on that, and we will move forward.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you. At the far end is Mahmoud Al-Kuhiji, and he is the CEO of Mumtalakat Holding Company from Bahrain. What do you see as investment possibilities in Russia? What questions do you have?
Okay, let me start by thanking you, Mr. President, for arranging this forum and for being invited in it. It gives us an opportunity really to meet our counterpart in Russia. Bahrain Mumtalakat is a sovereign wealth fund of Bahrain. And like all other sovereign wealth funds, we look across the globe for investment opportunities. We look for areas where we think there is sustainable growth and there is potential for investment that will give us a long-term return and stability. We have investment in Europe, we have investment in the US, and we have investment in other regions. And we're continuously looking at these opportunities. When you ask me about the Russian economy, I'll tell you one thing. I think the Russian economy is very promising, and the Russian economy have very solid fundamentals. Let me tell you why I see that way. I think when we look at the Russian economy from the outside, the Russian economy has skilled workforce, and they have a very educated workforce in the country itself. In addition to that, they have the resources that everybody talked about it, that couples with the manpower that they have. On top of that, Russian economy is a big market. Around it, there is a great, bigger market that will make it much easier for us to attract these markets from within the Russian economy. These three components really, it makes us feel very assured that it is a good market to invest in, and we think it will be a long-term investment we can do. Usually, when we go to any market, as any sovereign wealth fund, we try to look for a partner that enables us to work in these economies freely. I think, Mr. President, your initiative to set up the Russian Direct Investment Fund was a very, very comfortable and very big step in that direction. Because when we came in to invest in the Russian market, we found out an institution that knows the market, that works very professionally, and that's worked very transparently. That's what made us decide and tell them we're your partner in an automatic deal. Any investment you make in the Russian economy, we're your partner. I think those fundamentals really makes the Russian economy very attractive for us on the long term.
I keep forgetting it. On my right is Miguel Glucio, who is from Argentina, as you know, and with YPF. Argentina and Gazprom have signed a deal to work together to exploit shale gas. What are the opportunities between the two countries in the energy field?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the opportunity to participate in the forum. Energy is a very important matter for South America in general, particularly for my country that have experienced an economic growth during the last 10 years and is short of oil and gas production, and mainly gas. We've been blessed by God with enormous resources and conventional resources. We've been placed in the worldwide rank second in terms of gas resources and conventional gas resources, and number 4 in terms of unconventional oil resources. And after the nationalization of YPF, the production of the company have grown around 25%, and we have managed to experience that the unconventional resources can be economically produced. Now, saying that, we need to scale that experience to a different level, and for that, we require enormous amounts of capital investment, we require technology, we require know-how, and for that, we believe there's a huge opportunity following up the strategic cooperation that exists between our two countries, Russia and Argentina, to develop our resources and to cooperate in many fronts. And that opportunity have basically give Gazprom and YPF the opportunity to sign an MOU, and we are now looking at what are the fronts in which one we can cooperate and how we can help each other to develop the enormous resources and enormous potential that we have in our country.
Any comments on that? In terms of the opportunity, what's interesting to me as we listen to different regions is I listened to you say that the impact of sanctions may have been exaggerated elsewhere. How do you see the opportunities and the necessities for the full exploitation or the full advancement of the Russian economy? With respect to institutions, with respect to rule of law and things like that.
Первое, вы меня спросили о комментариях по поводу того, что...
First, you asked me to comment on what our colleagues have just said. As for Argentina, we discussed opportunities of cooperation in energy with the President of Argentina, Madam Kirchner, and we talked about it during her visit and during my visit to Argentina, and we agreed that our leading companies will work together. And then, sincerely speaking, I did not follow the process, but now I was very pleased to hear that some specific agreements have been reached about the launch of our joint efforts. Argentina, in fact, has a very wide potential, and joining efforts with one of the leading companies, and Gazprom is definitely one of the leading companies, can really bring good results. As for the sovereign funds, I'd like to say the following. If I'm not mistaken, the Sovereign Fund of Bahrain is not just a partner of Russian Direct Investment Fund. As far as I know, the countries have achieved an agreement about your fund participating in 10% in all the projects of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. Am I right saying that? Yes. I'd like to draw your attention to what our partners have agreed to do. When Russian Direct Investment Fund is implementing a project, the Bahrain Sovereign Fund is automatically involved, and the share of the Bahrain Sovereign Fund accounts for 10%. I guess this is a testimony of high professionalism of our experts from Direct Investments Fund. I'd like to ask you to welcome our partner and to thank him for the trust and confidence.
Не так все плохо с точки.
So, you know, speaking about the sanction, the situation is not that bad. There are pluses and minuses. This is a period when we are implementing structural changes and when we can take steps that will be opening new long-term prospects and that will allow us to bring good results in future. You've mentioned sanctions and you asked about what we are planning to do in order to overcome the current difficulties. I've characterized the situation that we are facing today, and it is very far from a catastrophe. We are planning to achieve several goals. They are not as ambitious as the goals that we used to set several years ago, but I hope that they will allow us to achieve better level of quality than before. What we are trying to achieve is, first, to ensure the growth of our economy for the forthcoming years. So the growth has to be about 3.5%, which is the average economic growth in the world. We also have to provide for our labor efficiency, that is to reach 5% annually. And the third indicator that I'd like to mention is the inflation rate. It has to be decreased to 4%. This is what we would like to achieve. In order to do that, we have to carry out a balanced and coordinated policy. All the trends that we are witnessing now in our economy allow us to believe that all these goals are achievable, and we hope that we'll be able to reach them in the near future. At that, we would not like to respond to any destructive actions that our partners are imposing on us, even to the detriment of their own economy. Based on the calculations, including on those of our European partners, some of them even mentioned losses of 40 or 50 billion. Based on the recent details that I've heard from Europe, experts believe that the losses European producers bear may amount up to 100 billion. Our turnover with Europe has decreased almost by a third or by a quarter. And with your country, with the United States, the turnover growth is 5.6%. Speaking about the flow of goods into the Russian Federation, their volume has decreased a little. Import has decreased by twice. It amounted to $30 billion, and now it is just 15 billion. At that, the structure of the turnover when it demonstrated growth, I mean the Russia-US turnover, the import has increased by about 11%. Of course, it does not amount for the losses that European producers are bearing, but I know for sure that no one wants to bear any losses at all. And speaking about the decrease in our country, in Europe, they are talking about stagnation and what we have to do in order to ensure unconditional growth of the global economy and to ensure growth in Russia, in Europe, and in all other countries of the world. We definitely have to stop imposing sanctions. And I'd like to emphasize that only sanctions imposed by the United Nations are legitimate. And speaking about how to achieve all those goals, we are going to broaden economic freedoms. We will expand economic freedoms to ensure competitive jurisdiction, and we'll also deal with human resources training and management system.
Sitting on my far right is Hein Thurman Thiel, owner and chairman of the supervisory board of Nora Bremse. What, as Russia makes this push because of sanctions and other considerations for import substitutions, what are the risks and opportunities there? How do you see it from a Western?
Ich glaube nicht, dass I don't think that I'm in a position to present here a European view about this problem, because everybody knows there are totally different views in our continent. But what I can do, I would like to give you my personal view on the question which you just put. I was, and I still are, totally against the sanctions. From the very beginning, by the way, and I'm not the only one in the German economy who have this position. It is high time, and I support the statement of President Putin. It's high time to stop these sanctions. And I hope now everybody in Europe has understand that this sanction have hurt Europe substantially. If you look to the figures, for instance, within 2 years, 2014 and 2015, Germany has lost 50% of their exports to Russia. If you look to, yes, I don't consider the local entities which we operate in your country, in Russia, where we also are heavily involved. And quite successfully, by the way, with your industry and the transport area. And we have very good experience with our partner in Russia. Coming back to other European countries, look to Italy, for instance. Italy is losing only 10% of their exports in comparison with last year. So it looks quite good for them. So the consequences in the different countries in Europe are totally different. And also the interests are totally different. We have no common interest in that respect. We have common decisions on the political level, but whatever the reasons are and the backgrounds are, this is totally wrong. And we need to understand that also Russia turning to the East is doing something quite normal, you see, because the East has a lot of opportunities to offer to Russia. And don't forget, we Europeans, and specifically Germans, even my company, I have a medium-sized company who's globally operating, we have strong connections with Chinese, and an extremely good business. And we are very pleased to work together with the Chinese. So why shouldn't Russia do the same? But the tragedy, in a way, maybe that's a little bit over-exaggerated, is the fact that we have boosted that trend by applying the sanctions. We must go away from that, but everybody should have the chance to make his decision where he finds the best partners for his specific business. Whether it's in the West or it's in the East, doesn't matter. We are supporting the global development, and I would like to add a peaceful development, which is not, at this moment, not satisfying at all.
When we were talking about foreign policy, another place I want to talk about, and including the remarks that we just heard, is the relationship with Germany, a strong economic power. And you've had a very good relationship with Chancellor Merkel. How do you see the future of Russia's relationship with Germany?
Будущее отношений России
Well, the
с любой
future of relations between Russia and any partner country depends not just on Russia. It's a two-way street, and we cannot achieve positive results through unilateral actions. But we strive to develop relations with Germany. My colleague just spoke about large number of German companies that are present on the Russian market. We're talking about 6,200 companies, and they all stayed, they're all still present. About 150 reduced their volume somewhat, but they remain present and they remain active. Moreover, I mentioned new enterprises opening up. One was launched today, and German companies, among others, were involved. We have traditional cooperation with them, and we're not planning to disrupt or even limit this cooperation. And this is not something that German businesses are seeking. We have very good, reliable, long-standing relations with them, and we'll do our utmost to preserve and develop them for the sake of Russia, Germany, European continent in general, and global economy alike. We spoke about the current state of the global economy. We are all aware that, in general, experts highlighting two big issues: low growth rate. Some even speak about stagnation, you know that. And experts think that the situation is likely to remain the same for some 24 months. And the second problem is excessive growth of debt burden that impedes growth. Country-wise, if we're talking about Europe, look at what's happening. Germany is showing very moderate growth, 1% last year. Look at France, 0.7%. Italy, colleague just mentioned, saying that things are all right. For a number of years, they've been having zero growth. In Japan, it's minus 1.4, by the way. That said, it is obvious that we all need additional points of growth, incentives for development. Mr. Tsipras said that the problem of Greece is not just a problem for Greece, but for all of Europe. I even took note of that. But when you owe somebody, you know, it's not just your problem, it's the problem of your lender as well, true. But look at what happened. Integration processes offer a lot of benefits, open markets, cheap loans, etc., but there are also downfalls. You cannot regulate national currency because there is no longer a national currency, and you're very tightly linked to currency that is oriented to export economy. You cannot manage your policies in agriculture, tourism, fisheries. There are restrictions, there are limitations. So it has to be very balanced. But we are curious because we are following very closely what happens in Europe because it's a major trading partner. Indeed, the volume of trade went down. Bilateral trade with Europe, significantly so, but Europe still remains a leading trading partner. And Germany is #1 out of all European countries, and I hope that the problems will go away and we'll continue developing relationship further. We are prepared.
You have been generous in your time, Mr. President, here in St. Petersburg at this forum. One last question from me. The role that Russia wants to play in the world in 2015. I've listed a number of hot issues, whether it is your borders and whether it's the Baltic states or whether it is Ukraine, in the Middle East, there is ISIS and there is Syria, there's a relationship with the United States. And at the same time, some people have said that you have more unconstrained power than any Russian leader for a while. My question is, how do you see and how will you play a role in these big problems and where you will take the initiative because of how you and your leadership has changed Russia? Clearly, you're stronger militarily. Clearly, you seem to be more aggressive, although you don't like me to use that word, I suspect. But how do you make Russia a serious part of the solution as the great power it is?
Мне не понравилось, что вы говорите об агрессии.
I did not like you using the term aggression. Aggressive. Correct. We're not being aggressive. We are persistent. We are consistent in pursuing our interests than before. For a long time, for decades, we're silent, we're putting on the table various options for cooperation, but we're pushed farther and farther away until the red line we cannot cross. And I want to make that very clear. I said at the very beginning of our discussion, one should not try change the global landscape. Rather take things as they stand and work in the spirit of mutual respect, jointly look for solutions to global problems. Russia is not striving for dominance or to be recognized as superpower. We're not imposing our own standards or models on anyone. What we're seeking are equal partnership with all members of international community, United States, European partners, in Asia alike, will base cooperation on the principles of mutual respect and equality. And this is what we're going to be guided by. When it comes to international cooperation, we remain committed. We adhere to the principles of international law, fundamental instruments such as the UN Charter, and when it comes to the economy, since it's the Economic Forum, we'll strive to achieve greater economic liberty. We'll try to make the economy more efficient, try to diversify it. We'll try to make sure that through this import substitution, and by the way, we're planning to allocate over 2.5 trillion rubles very shortly. We're planning to rebuild high-tech production where we can and must be more competitive, and not just to make sure that we're capable to defend ourselves, but to develop our economy, to open new prospects for development, to raise living standards and prosperity level for our people.
We live in a complex world, and thank you so much for being here in your hometown to talk about these issues.
Спасибо. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. I thank all the participants, all the panelists, all of you that came to St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Thank you for being so friendly. Seriously. No, I mean it. It was a friendly discussion. Well, some points were difficult, but still very friendly. I thank you, your team, you're the big boss. And ladies always keep in the shadow. There is a charming young lady sitting opposite who kept showing you some papers. She was probably guiding you. You know, women keep in the shadow, but they do the difficult task. Please stand up and let us give a round of applause to the charming young lady.
That's my executive producer, Yvette Vega. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much.